Hi, I'm Matt Bell from Sound Mind Investing. I'm talking today with Christine Benz, who is Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning at Morningstar, and she's the author of a great book about retirement called How to Retire. It's a collection of 20 interviews with subject matter experts on a variety of really important retirement-related topics. So, Christine, it's a pleasure to talk with you. I really appreciate you making the time today.
Matt, thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and thank you for the kind words about the book.
So tell me a little bit about the origins of the book. How did you come up with the idea for this book? I mean, what was kind of missing in your mind from the retirement literature, if you will? And how did you come up with the particular format of the book?
The format really drove the project, and that credit for that has to go to my editor at Harriman House, which published the book. He and I had been talking about me doing some kind of a retirement book for a while because I do toil on retirement planning for my job at Morningstar, and I really just could not find the time. And so Craig said, well, what if we styled the book as a series of interviews? Would that be a lighter lift for you? And I thought, well, it probably would be. And the other really nice aspect of the format, which is each chapter is a lesson with some expert in that area. The format, I loved that it leveraged all of these external experts who I've gotten to meet along my journey researching retirement planning. And it didn't require me to put myself in the expert seat on all of these topics because I really did want to cover a huge range of topics from housing and healthcare to, the nitty gritty aspects of retirement portfolio planning and withdrawal rates and all that stuff. And so it allowed me to leverage great expertise that I personally did not possess, where I know a little bit about a lot of these topics, but I don't know enough to do a whole lesson on them. So I love the way that the book came out. And I also just love that some of these experts actually disagreed with each other a little bit, which I think is absolutely fine at the end of the day.
So, since you do write about this topic on a regular basis, I'm wondering if there were any surprises for you. Were there any insights that seemed especially maybe surprising or especially fresh for you as you talked with these various experts?
One recurrent theme in a number of chapters is this role of phasing into retirement very gradually over a period of years versus making it a hard stop. I truly think that is a best practice in the realm of retirement planning. And of course, some people do not have control over their retirement dates. They are forced out of the workforce earlier than they might like, or they might have health concerns that prompt them to retire earlier than they might like. But to the extent that you do have control and can stay in the driver's seat with respect to your work retirement segue, I do think that phasing into retirement, perhaps working a little bit longer, is the right answer for many of us. So many of the experts who I talked to did reiterate that viewpoint. It got me thinking about my own retirement a little bit, about the value of potentially phasing in. Another sort of softer consideration that came up in several spots within the book was the role of relationships and how much of our relationships, connections to other people do come through work. And so I think it's super important in the years leading up to retirement to make sure that you're being thoughtful about what your relationships will look like. One thing I've heard from actual retirees is that the work relationships that they thought might stick really didn't. Some may, some may not. And so it's helpful to be preemptive about that. If you are finding a lot of your social connection through work, do a little bit of reconnaissance in advance of retirement and check out where you will go for relationships, where you will naturally, organically meet people. So I think that was kind of a surprise, just how many experts accentuated the importance of those social connections, especially later in life, but really throughout our lives.
One of the people you interviewed, Fritz Gilbert, he seemed to suggest in his comments that people will just kind of know financially. They'll be able to tell fairly clearly when they're able to retire. And it made me wonder, Is that the reality for most people? We kind of have a mantra in our culture, I feel like, of more. We always need more. I always feel like we need more. And so how can people really get to that point, do you think, of having confidence that they have enough to be able to retire and to have peace of mind about that?
I'm with you, Matt, that I don't think retirees necessarily know. In fact, I hear a lot of angst in my contact with pre-retirees or even actual retirees about whether they will have enough. And certainly there are research studies that you can look at. We do some research at Morningstar on safe withdrawal rates, but a number of other entities have had a go at helping retirees figure out how much they can safely spend from their portfolios if they want them to last over whatever time horizon that they expect to have in retirement. So you can start there. I think potentially getting some third-party financial advice can make a ton of sense, just to give you a little bit more confidence with that spending plan. And then you can also fiddle around with the probabilities of success. So the withdrawal rate research that we work on at Morningstar, we incorporate a 90% success rate, but we'll talk to other people in the retirement planning space who say that retirees can actually use a lower success rate than that if they're prepared to potentially reduce their spending if they happen to encounter a bad market environment, especially early on in their retirement. So those are a few things I think that people can think about to give themselves a little bit more comfort with their retirement spending plan.
And I don't know if this is a wholly different question necessarily, but maybe a related question. It seems like a common fear when people do finally end up retiring is running out of money. And so there are a number of questions related to that idea. But how do people, do you think, and what did you hear through the various interviews that you did about what are some ways that people can have confidence as they live in retirement that they won't run out?
Yeah, a few things. One is, I think a huge amount of angst in this area comes from people worrying about long-term care because that's really the risk factor that is very hard to predict. I think roughly 50-50 are the odds that you are likely to need some type of paid long-term care. And so retirees and pre-retirees necessarily worry about this idea of, will I be one of the people who has this big balloon payment toward the end of retirement? So I think everyone, as they embark on retirement, does need some kind of a long-term care plan, which doesn't mean you necessarily need long-term care insurance. Maybe that's going to be the right solution for some people. But if your plan is to go without long-term care insurance, you at least need to figure out, well, okay, if I am truly asset constrained, what would relying on Medicaid provided care entail? What would the ramifications be in terms of the choices of where I could receive that care? And then at the other end of the spectrum, people who have a lot of wealth might say, well, I plan to fund long-term care if it arises out of my own assets. And for them, I think it makes a lot of sense to figure out roughly how much you would want to set aside and also segregate those long-term care assets from your spendable assets. So that's one thing I think you can do. The other thing I think that you can do to give yourself a little bit more comfort with your retirement spending and not running out is just to recognize when we look at the research on how retirees actually spend, what we see is that spending tends to trend down throughout the life cycle. So it's highest usually in those early years of retirement, but then often does trend down fairly steadily, even throughout like the 65 to 85-year period. And then sometimes we see it flare up later in life for some of those uninsured long-term care costs that we just talked about. So if you are okay with assuming that your spending will generally follow that pattern and trend down throughout most of your retirement, well, that means that you can spend a little bit more earlier on because you will probably be spending a little bit less as the years go by.
And on the flip side, you touched on the topic of underspending, that there are some people that are so conservative in their retirement that they end up maybe missing out on some things that they would have enjoyed if they just felt a little bit more free to spend. And so what are some of the things that you heard from some of the folks you talked to about kind of walking that line between not underspending so much and maybe missing out versus spending too much and then running that risk of actually running out?
Right. This is something I hear from advisors all the time who work with clients. And it seems almost a little perverse to discuss because we do have a lot of people in our society who are quite undersaved relative to what they will need in retirement. So it's a very high class problem that I think we almost tend not to discuss it. But I do think this is a very real problem for a lot of retirees. And it's not even quite a problem, but it is an underutilization of their assets that I can't tell you how many times I've been out speaking and I've had someone clearly in his or her 80s come up and proudly tell me that they only spend 2 or 3% of their portfolio balance per year. And my thought is, I hope that is enough to give you the quality of life that you're looking for. And I also think people who are underspending are shortchanging themselves just in terms of opportunities for lifetime giving. That oftentimes the goal is to leave loved ones with assets at the end of their lives. But the problem is, or sort of one drawback of that strategy is that you haven't had the opportunity to see your assets working for your loved ones during your lifetime. So I do think this whole problem, we've been internally at Morningstar been calling it kind of a permission to spend problem. I think it's a genuine phenomenon for some retirees, especially for people who have kind of styled themselves as savers, as investors. It becomes part of your identity, and it's really hard to undo that. But I do think that if you kind of reframe it, if you're not thinking of it in terms of spending on yourself, but perhaps spending on others in your orbit who you care about, I think that makes it a little easier to find permission to spend in line with what you could actually spend.
That's a great idea. Is an annuity part of the answer there? I think I've remember reading that you were suggesting that an annuity can sometimes give people, since it's that steady income, kind of the freedom or the permission to spend more. And so if it is part of the answer, there's so many different types of annuities these days. Are there certain types that you tend to gravitate toward, and are there certain types that you tend to recommend people avoid?
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I've concluded that the term annuity is so broad that it's almost unhelpful because it encompasses so many different product types. The type of annuity that I tend to favor would be the very plain vanilla, very low cost annuity type, just a basic immediate income annuity or potentially a deferred income annuity where you buy it when you start retirement, but it won't begin to pay you until some later date in your retirement. So a common configuration there would be you buy the annuity at age 65 and it begins paying you a stream of income at, say, age 85. And that can be attractive if your goal is to have kind of a hedge against outliving your assets. It would allow you to plan for your portfolio to last for that 20-year horizon, 65 to 85. And then any years beyond that, that's where the annuity would pick up. With an immediate annuity, it would begin making payments right away. But the reason I favor those annuity types is that they're very easy to comparison shop among them. So you can plug in your own variables and come out with some quotes on annuities. There's a lot of transparency there. In general, these are not great money makers for insurance companies, not in the way that some of the other annuity types with more bells and whistles, like the variable annuities, would tend to be more profitable for the insurance company. So I favor the very simple annuities, but I do think that one of the reasons that someone might look at an annuity would be the idea that it's kind of a one and done type purchase. So if you buy that annuity, you're reducing the need to go in there and take sums out of your portfolio. You're just getting that stream of cash flow delivered to you, which I do think psychologically could help some of these folks who would otherwise underspend. It might give them a little bit more freedom to spend an appropriate amount. And as a side note, I know an older adult, he's now over 100 years old, but he purchased an annuity very early in his retirement. And the insurance company was kind of the loser in this situation because he's 100 plus and still drawing on the annuity. But he uses the checks from that annuity to give to his family. So it's sort of like a dedicated gifting fund. And I think that's a really lovely idea as well.
It's great. So some topics seem to come up time and time again over the course of your interviews for the book. And so that would seem to indicate that they're especially important. And so one of those topics was sequence of returns risk, which is a fancy term, but a very important issue, very important idea. So explain briefly, what is that for those that may not be familiar with that term? And what were some of the ideas that you heard over the course of your interviews that can help combat that?
Definitely. It's one of the most important risk factors that retirees need to be on guard against. And the basic idea there is bad market conditions occurring early in your retirement. So that might be a bad stock market, it might be a bad bond market, it might be very high inflation, or maybe a combination of those factors. So we had a little bit of that in 2022, 2021, 2022, where we had high inflation, which was followed by rising interest rates that hurt bond prices and hurt stock prices all at once. The most dramatic example of that was in kind of the late 1960s, early 1970s, where you had sort of a drawn out period of those same general phenomenon. But it is a risk factor that you want to be mindful of, because if you have those bad market conditions that occur early on and you are simultaneously spending too much from your portfolio during that bad market environment, it simply leaves less of the portfolio, less of your investment assets in place to repair themselves and recover when market conditions eventually do. So if we're overspending during such a period, that can be really bad for your a portfolio's long run ability to last. So, in terms of how we guard against it, a couple of ideas. One is simply being willing to be flexible with your withdrawals. So, if that bad market shows up and you have built in enough flexibility into your spending plan to take less during those years, that will tend to be a good hedge against sequence of return risk. And then another thing is it relates to portfolio structure. So you would want to set up enough of your assets in safer assets that you could draw upon to leave the assets that have dwindled to recover. So that's the thinking behind using kind of a bucket strategy to organize your portfolio, where you have a runway of safer assets that you could spend through if your stock portfolio fell down and stayed down. And incidentally, the stock piece is really the focus when we talk about sequence of return risk, because stock periods of stock drawdowns can be longer and deeper than is the case with other assets. So that's, the intuition behind making sure that you come into retirement with enough safer assets, that you don't want to be all equity during such a period, because you want to guard against another sort of lost decade for stocks like we had in the 2000s.
You just mentioned the term flexibility, which is one of those terms, one of those ideas that came up several times over the course of your interviews. And so you were just touching on the importance of being flexible in your spending to be able to adapt to different market conditions. But we do hear a lot of rules when it comes to retirement planning. We hear about, you could probably live on 80% of your pre-retirement income in retirement, and you can withdraw 4% from your portfolio safely, plus a factor for inflation each year and not run out of money. But tell me some of the other aspects or other areas where flexibility plays a role, because I think that seems to be one of those really important ideas is to maintain levels of flexibility.
Definitely. Flexibility is important with respect to your retirement spending. Um, for the reason that I just mentioned, that if you can take less in a bad market environment, you should be able to take a little bit more in a good market environment. And I interviewed John Guyton for one of the chapters in the book. He's a financial planner, but he's also a retirement researcher. And he made the really cool point that this idea of being flexible with your portfolio withdrawals is something that makes sense for your portfolio for the reasons that we talked about, but it also is probably going to feel right to you behaviorally, that at the time when the market's down, when your portfolio's down, well, you're feeling a little less rich during those periods. You're probably feeling a little less like you want to take a big splurgy trip, for example. Well, guess what? That's a good impulse for your portfolio. And by the same token, we've had a really great equity market in 2023, 2024. And if you're feeling a little bit more flush, well, that's probably okay too. You should be able to spend a little bit more. So John noted that that's the rare thing that is good for your portfolio that also probably feels like the right thing to do. So staying flexible there is super important. Jamie Hopkins had a whole discussion about adaptability. So sort of stepping away from just the retirement spending equation, he makes the point that to the extent that you could come into retirement, not have this rigid view of what your retirement will look like, what it'll be like, that really will set you up for a better retirement than if you kind of have a rigid mindset about, well, here's how it's going to be, here's where I'll live for my whole retirement, or whatever else the case might be. That if you can keep yourself adaptable as you move into retirement, that just makes your plan much more resilient than would be the case if you were not as adaptable. And of course, as we age, we do tend to calcify a little bit in terms of our habits and our beliefs and all that stuff. But I do think that the happiest, healthiest retirees do have that flexibility mindset, do have that adaptability that they're bringing to things.
Another one of those topics that came up several times was cognitive decline, kind of a brutal topic to contemplate, but probably one that's important to contemplate early, because I think when we're healthy, it's hard to envision not being healthy at some point. But what can people do? What should people do maybe earlier than later when it comes to preparing for that?
Certainly, with the financial dimension, we talked about the value of having a long-term care plan. I think that is essential. But then I think you also want to think through the logistics of how you might wish to receive care, and then articulate those thoughts to your loved ones to let them know. I think of my mom and dad, for example, had telegraphed to us that they very much wanted to receive care in their home. And so when the time came that my mom and dad needed long-term care, we knew that we wanted to try to take steps to make that happen. So to the extent that we can articulate these things for our loved ones, that really lightens the load for them, that they have a clear sense of what you want. And also, I think giving them a sense of, well, here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want anyone quitting their job. I don't want anyone, if my cognitive decline is so extreme that I don't know who you are, I don't want you to be taking extraordinary measures to keep me in my home. If it's more economical and better for all involved for me to receive care in some type of a facility, and I'm in such a state that I'm not compos mentis, well, then you should have my permission to make decisions that would suit my needs at that point in time. So, thinking all that stuff through and articulating it, I think, is a huge gift that we can give our loved ones. And then a harder thing is figuring out what your safeguards are in case you experience cognitive decline. So, if you're part of a married couple, you kind of have a built-in safeguard where you probably have a spouse keeping pretty close tabs on what's going on with you. But if you're a solo ager, if you're single or divorced or widowed, well, you'd need to just make sure that on an ongoing basis, there's another set of eyes on you. And that might be hiring some sort of paid caregiver or moving into some sort of facility where there is inherently a little bit more of a safety net. But I do think it's that's sort of a tough thing to troubleshoot, but it's important to think about, like, what is my next line of defense if I encounter cognitive decline?
I would think it's also really important to have all the paperwork in place, right? To make sure you've got a power of attorney for
Absolutely.
financial decisions and that sort of thing as well.
Absolutely. The financial dimension of this is huge. And more generally speaking, even apart from cognitive decline, older adults do tend to be more vulnerable to financial scams. And so it's important to have safeguards in place. Ideally, if you don't have a financial advisor, you'd at least have some kind of financial buddy who is keeping tabs on your investments, on your financial plan. I know that I was very much there for my mom and dad as they aged, but I think about so many older adults, especially the DIY type investors who have done very well for themselves during their accumulation careers. I think they're more vulnerable. And so they need to make sure that they have put in place some sorts of safeguards against the potential to be defrauded.
Well, a lot of planning is really unique to the individual, to their circumstances, and to their goals and their hopes for the future. Are there certain, do you think, absolutes or close to absolutes that really do pertain to most, if not all people? Like, for example, trying to hold off on Social Security until you're 70 or making sure your home is paid off by the time you retire. Are there certain absolutes, do you think, like that?
Not too many, Matt, actually. Even the Social Security decision, I do firmly believe that it often does make sense for people to delay, but there might be situations such as someone has a very serious health condition and maybe they're a single person, in which case there's no one else who is depending on your Social Security income. In that instance, it might make sense to claim early. So I would say that unfortunately, there are very few absolutes in the realm of retirement planning. It is very individual specific.
I wonder if there are certain assumptions that about retirement that people tend to make that might be worth questioning. I'm not sure that this was really touched on in your book, but I'm curious to get your point of view about this nonetheless. So, for example, it seems like travel is something you see so many retirees are looking forward to traveling, that they've got a place in mind they want to go. And yet I wonder, is there a danger in your mind of maybe holding that dream until retirement and then you get there and maybe your health prevents you from being able to do that traveling? And so maybe it would be better somehow to arrange your finances to take those trips when for sure you're healthy enough to enjoy them.
Absolutely. I have come to believe that that period from, say, age 50 to maybe your mid 60s is a wonderful life stage to start doing some pre-retirement work. And I think you want to be thinking about, well, yes, do we move forward with some of these things that, in the past people might have saved for retirement? Do we pursue them earlier rather than later? Um, and also work with your employer a little bit in terms of how can we style my job? And maybe this is something you do sort of in stealth mode or something that you discuss overtly with your employer, but it's a great time to be thinking about, well, how can I make make my job more agreeable, where I want to do it longer and I want to cast off the things that I really don't enjoy earlier. So I've been urging people to take what I call the Sunday night calendar test, where you're looking ahead to sort of the week coming up, and inevitably you see things on your calendar where you are really excited about that day, like, oh, I've got this meeting with these colleagues who I really enjoy on this project that I'm interested in. And then you have other days where you're like, oh, that's going to be kind of a slog. I'm going to have to get through it. Can you be sort of mindful about prioritizing your work to make that balance of activities more agreeable to you so that you feel like doing them longer? So I very much support the idea of people embarking on some pre-retirement work, and I think that age 50 mark is a good year to start pursuing it.
I think another one of those common assumptions is to leave money for the kids, and that's a noble thing. It sounds like, and a good thing. But I wonder if perhaps that could be rethought in some ways, where maybe we want to give some of the inheritance early so that we can enjoy seeing the kids, the adult children, enjoy the benefits of having that money while we're still around to see that.
I've come to be such a believer in that idea of lifetime giving, and that might be to charity, but it might also be to friends and certainly family members, children, grandchildren. And the idea is that, just as you said, you're able to see your money working for your loved ones. And I think a really compelling thing about this is that fairly small sums can make a bigger difference than people might expect. So things like help with that first home down payment, or help with someone who wants to go back to school, or help with student loan pay down for children or grandchildren. Those kinds of things can be incredibly impactful because they might come at life stages for your kids and grandchildren when you're really in a position to make a difference. When we look at the data on when people inherit money, it's often when they're in their mid 50s, even their early 60s, from their parents. And by that life stage, yes, the infusion of cash might be welcome, but people's financial fortunes are often pretty well set by that life stage. Whereas when someone's in their 20s or 30s, that is when people are really getting their lives off the ground. And I think you can make a big impact at that life stage. And then, kind of a separate point I would make on this topic is have that discussion with your kids about your plans. Many children, in my experience, might say, well, I love that you're thinking about me. My main thought is that you should enjoy this money that you've managed to save, that is my priority. I would rather not see you do less for yourself. If you happen to have something left over in the end, that's perfectly fine. But I love families having that dialogue, but because I think some parents might be pleasantly surprised that their kids might say, you have done plenty for me. Now it's your time to enjoy what you've managed to save.
I have a few questions about the bucket strategy. This is something you've written about quite a bit on Morningstar's website. And so for people that aren't perhaps not familiar with it, though, maybe just briefly, if you would describe what is the bucket strategy? And then I do have a few questions I want to ask you about putting it into practice.
Sure. I always have to credit Harold Avensky, who is a financial planning professor and a financial planner himself, because he put the bug in my ear about bucket investing probably 20 years ago. He and I were talking, and at the time, yields were very, very low on cash and bond securities. And so I remember kind of asking, well, Harold, since income really isn't there, how do you extract cash flows for your clients? And his point was, well, I run this total return portfolio, but I also bolt on this cash bucket where we hold maybe a couple of years worth of planned portfolio withdrawals in cash. And he made the point that it really works behaviorally, that his clients, because they know that they have their near-term cash flow needs set aside, they're not worried when the portfolio goes down. And they're also not micromanaging his activities because they're kind of able to tune out what is going on with the long-term investment portfolio. So I do think in my subsequent talking about the bucket strategy, I've been hearing from a lot of retirees that it it really does seem to work for them behaviorally, where it keeps the peace in volatile market environments like 2022 when stocks were down, bonds were down at the same time. So that's the basic idea that you're organizing your portfolio by your anticipated cash flow needs. So for maybe years 1 and 2 of retirement, you'd want to just have cash assets. You have a little bit of inflation risk there, but you shouldn't have any volatility with that portion of your portfolio. And then you're just kind of stepping out on the risk spectrum from there. So in my 3 bucket system, you've got maybe 5 to 8 years worth of portfolio cash flows in high quality bonds. The idea is that if the cash were depleted, but you still needed additional funds to pull from, those high quality bonds would be pretty resilient in many market environments. And then for years 10 and beyond of your retirement, you're holding a globally diversified equity portfolio, which doesn't mean that you sort of plow through those buckets in sequence. The idea really is that each year you're kind of taking a step back and saying, well, which of these 3 main asset classes does it make sense for me to pull from? So in 2022, stocks down, bonds down, you probably want to be pulling from cash in a year like that. In 2023 and 2024, stocks were up. For many investors, I would argue that their living expenses were hiding in plain sight in their appreciated equity holdings, especially US equity. So it just has a nice flexibility to it. And I think it's just a tremendous illustration tool for why you would want to hold X amount in each of the major asset classes. If you think about it in terms of time segmentation, it just makes it all make a lot more sense, at least in my mind.
So tell me how to get started with that. Like, how do you build that cash bucket, for example? Do you recommend that people be building that in the years leading up to retirement, say the 5 years before they plan to retire? Or do you kind of get to the point of knocking on the door of retirement and then you reallocate your portfolio where you've got these 2 years in cash?
You probably don't want to wait until the very last minute. So ideally, I would start being deliberate about building up that cash cushion in maybe the 3 to 5 years leading up to retirement. Fritz Gilbert, I think in the book, shares the idea of just sending all of your new contributions into cash. I think that that's a way to address it where you're not necessarily pulling from appreciated equity or bond holdings, but you're instead putting your new contributions into cash. But you don't want to wait until the very last minute. You don't want to wait until the first day or year of retirement because of what we talked about earlier, that sequence of return risk. You're not sure when that bad market environment might materialize. So in the years leading up to retirement, you'd want to be thoughtful about building up that cash bucket.
So when you think about the terminology, or you get that mental image of buckets, I think it tends to conjure up an image of distinct accounts. And in the real world, you might have a traditional IRA, for example, that has quite a bit of money in it. And so is it a matter of actually having distinct buckets in distinct accounts, or is it more of a spreadsheet exercise?
A little more of the latter. So you'd want to be thinking about the sequence of returns that you might use with your various pools of assets. So many of us will be bringing traditional tax deferred assets into retirement, as well as Roth, as well as taxable. Often the taxable assets are what you hear about coming first in terms of that withdrawal queue, in part because they don't really have any inherent tax benefits attached to them. Then you'd probably want to move on to traditional tax deferred and then on to Roth, or save Roth for last because their tax benefits are the greatest. So you'd want to kind of think about this bucket approach overlaying your multiple account types. I don't think you need to go through the process of organizing buckets within each of those multiple accounts. So say I'm thinking about embarking on my retirement and I'm planning for my early year withdrawals to come from that taxable category, well, there obviously I'd want to hold more liquidity, right? Because if those are the assets I'm drawing from, I'd probably want to have my bucket one assets there, potentially some of my bucket two assets as well. So you'd want to marry those two things together. The buckets look so simple, but most of us will be bringing multiple accounts into retirement. If you're part of a married couple, you can kind of double the complexity. So you'd want to think about the bucket structure sort of overhanging the different tax pools of assets that you might have.
And how often do you recommend that people are transferring money between the buckets? Is this a monthly maintenance exercise, or is this a once a year sort of thing?
I think once a year is plenty for most retirees. I love a good December portfolio review where you are doing any rebalancing that should come into play for your portfolio, where you're pulling from appreciated assets, you're taking risk out of your portfolio, you are potentially replenishing any cash reserves that you've spent in the past year. You're doing a little bit of tax planning, so you might, if you're over age 72 or 73, you're subject to required minimum distributions, so they need to get into the mix as well. But ideally, this is kind of an integrated once yearly look. I don't think you'd want to be doing it much more than once a year. You probably have other things to do in retirement. I think that good once annual review should be plenty for many retirees.
And from a big picture perspective, the bucket strategy, I love the concept of it. It sounds, it sounds like the answer to one of the earlier questions we talked about how do you have peace of mind that the money's not going to run out. I think that system, I think theoretically, it makes a lot of sense for people that this is a way to have peace of mind that the money will last as long as I need it to. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty of actually making it happen, I think it raises more questions perhaps for some people. And so, for example, in an up year, when that long-term bucket is appreciating, how do you figure out how much of that do you transfer to the bucket number two or to bucket number one or to just directly live off of? How do you kind of operationalize this whole thing, for example, in a positive market environment?
Yeah, it's easier said than done. I have written about bucket maintenance before because it's not quite as straightforward as it looks on my little three bucket slide. But the basic idea is yes, each year you are looking at your ideally you would have a portfolio target allocation and you're comparing your portfolio's allocations to the major asset classes relative to that target. So the example you gave, Matt, where someone would have come through a strong equity market and they'd want to try to measure where their equity allocation is relative to whatever that target is. And that can help determine whether any changes are in order. In a lot of market environments, the changes won't be meaningful enough to have to make changes, but that's the basic idea is that you have some sort of a target asset allocation that you're sticking to.
I know that one of the big picture goals of the bucket strategy is to not have to take money out of that long-term bucket during a declining market environment. And yet it's not, there's no guarantees in life, right? And so it's
Right.
not guaranteed to prevent you from having to do that. I'm thinking of a, really bad year like 2008. How do you look at the bucket strategy in a year like that and the years that followed where you're trying to maybe make up lost ground in that long-term bucket?
It's a good question. And, I think you'd want to have a long view in mind rather than a year by year view. So one thing we know is that, yes, equities are volatile, but if you have a 10-year holding period at least, stocks are actually pretty reliable where they are upwards of 85%, almost 90% of the time in positive territory, assuming you have a 10-year holding period. But when you shrink that holding period to 5 years or certainly 1 year, stocks are much less reliable, right? That's why you're building that bulwark of safer assets so that you're not touching equities during a period in which they've declined. So that's the basic thought on having roughly 10 years worth of non-equity assets is that for those shorter time frames when you might need funds, you're not having to tap those equities when they're in a trough. So that's how I would approach it. And then, the interesting thing is, like, in a 2008 style environment, that was actually a halfway decent market environment for bonds, for a couple of reasons. One is that we were in a recession, and the Fed is often pulling back on interest rates. Interest rates were going down during that period, which is good for the bond prices. So your bucket two was probably appreciating a little bit in a year like that. And then bonds are also pretty reliable in a flight to quality, which we often see in recessionary periods like that. So I think that the bucket strategy should prove pretty resilient, but the main idea is that you do want to have a nice long holding period for stocks.
At the end of the book, you make the point that, of course, you can't help but look at some of the insights that you gained in interviewing all these folks and really thinking about this topic, perhaps more deeply. Can't help but look at this through your own filter of your own life and your own retirement planning. And so I'm curious to know, you do have some key takeaways at the end of the book, which are really great and really helpful. But I'm wondering, specifically on your planning for retirement, your own household, what are some things that perhaps you've changed as a result of having had all these interviews and all this input from all these different experts?
The phased retirement was one that I mentioned has been really influential in my thinking about my own retirement, and how I'm urging my husband to think about his retirement as well. So that's been one piece. I've also changed my thinking over the years, not so much in researching the book, but as I have gotten more information, I've gotten a little more amenable to the annuity idea than I was initially. I probably was one of those people who reflexively had annuities marked with a skull and crossbones because there are so many junky products out there. But I do think that for our own plan, I really love the idea of trying to use Social Security plus potentially some type of an annuity product to align with our fixed spending. So the stuff that we have to spend on year in, year out, month in, month out, I want to try to have those expenses covered with non-portfolio income sources, because I think we'll just worry that much less about our portfolio withdrawals, everything else, if we know that a lot of our cash flow needs are coming from non-portfolio income sources. So that's one area where I have probably changed my thinking over the past, say, 5 or so years as I've learned a little bit more about how retirees who do have more fixed cash flows tend to be a little bit happier and less parsimonious. And there are a lot of non-financial advantages that come along with more guaranteed income.
Christine, this has been a lot of fun talking with you and really, really helpful, really, really informative. So thank you for your time.
Well, thanks for all the great questions, Matt. I've enjoyed it.
Christine Benz is Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning at Morningstar and the author of this book, How to Retire. I've read it cover to cover. It's a great book, great resource, highly recommend it. So thanks so much for watching. I'm Matt Bell from Sound Mind Investing.